October, the season of Halloween, and the objectively spookiest month of the year. Sure would have been nice if I'd managed to finish this video in time before the month ended. Just goes to show that schedules are the scariest things in life. There's only one Pokemon type suitable for this month. Well, technically two, but this one is way more fitting. Ghost was and is one of the most powerful types in all of Pokemon. I do not say that with any exaggeration whatsoever. That's how it was in the past, back in Generation 1, it's how it is in the present today in Generation 9, and it's how it will be in future generations going forward. Ghost being powerful was the intended design of the original game designers back in Gen 1, with both its placement in the game and the general secondary material all openly advertising that intent. Remember that one classic anime episode where Ash getting a Haunter to counter Sabrina was treated as such a huge deal? That's because the Ghost type was a huge deal. Ghost was the type specialty of Agatha, the third Elite Four member. Agatha's position alone speaks volumes about how powerful the designers expected the Ghost type to be. The only opponents that came after her were Lance, who specialized in Dragon, and Blue, who was your rival and had a full mixed type team. In other words, despite the type only having a single Pokemon line, the game's designers felt that the type was so powerful, it was worthy of being the third final opponent of the main game. Those are some high expectations. So, in the spirit of Halloween, let's look into the game design behind the Ghost type and see if and how it lived up to those expectations. A huge part of the Ghost type's power stems from its defensive properties. As its name implies, the Ghost type's main gimmick lies in its ghostly immunities to being punched. In the context of Pokemon, as a game, a type immunity is a pretty big deal. Resistances halve damage taken, sure, but damage is still taken. You still need proper defensive stats to make solid use out of them. If you have poor defenses and the opponent has huge offenses, you'll still find yourself taking severe damage even if resisted. Remember that moves in Pokemon have a same type attack bonus of 50%. Resisting an unboosted move reduces damage from 100% to 50%, but resisting a same type move reduces damage from 150% to 75%. So it's more damage than it may initially seem. Immunities don't care about that at all. Regardless of attack or defenses, damage taken is still 0%. Immunities are pretty much the closest thing the early generation Pokemon games had to a hard counter. Any type which is immune to another had the matchup stacked so highly in their favor that the matchup is almost unwinnable. You can't easily access coverage moves either because of how restrictive move pools were back then. The Ghost type features not just one, but two immunities, both of which are hugely significant too. Normal is the most common type in the game, with a large majority of Pokemon and attacks being categorized as normal. This meant that a player-controlled Ghost type was practically untouchable to a huge number of in-game opponents outright. Fighting was also initially expected to be one of the strongest types, by virtue of being the only type with super effectiveness over normal. So being immune to what was intended to be the best physical offense type is a massive defensive asset. Emphasis on the words initially expected. Reality proved otherwise. Fighting was probably the second biggest design failure of the Gen 1 type system. To add on to that, Ghost only had a single weakness, itself. That's a very dangerous line of design, because it can create a very centralized metagame if handled improperly, as the best option to counter a Ghost would just be another Ghost. For anyone who's played Team Fortress 2, do you remember how the best counter to a good sniper is just another better sniper? Yeah, the difference is that unlike TF2, you can't just call in a Ghostbuster with a shotgun to resolve the problem. So yeah, that one weakness to only itself would already make it defensively great, but also being immune to two highly relevant types make Ghost one of the best defensive types in the game. What about resistances? Well, they existed. Technically, bug moves didn't really exist back in early generations. The only bug moves in Gen 1 were Twin Needle and Pin Missile, which were only found on Beedrill and Jolteon. Took until Generation 2 to invent Mega Horn just for Heracross, with Fury Cutter now existing as a mediocre attack for Paras and Cypher at least. As for poison moves, Gen 1 had Sludge, 65 power. Yup, sure is useful to resist that. At least Gen 2 invented Sludge Bomb, so the poison resistance saw some relevance then. The next logical step in design to complete this playstyle is to therefore make Ghost weak offensively. You know, trading offense for defense. Seems straightforward, I shouldn't need to explain that. This was something the designers absolutely did. Offensively, apart from itself, Ghost type moves were super effective against nothing? Yup, that's right. Back in Generation 1, Ghost wasn't super effective against Psychic at all. In fact, it was the complete opposite way around. Psychic was immune to Ghost moves, which meant that the famous Sabrina anime episode from back in the day was actually complete blatant false advertising. Just think of how many impressionable young kids watched the show on Sunday morning television and went on to catch a Ghastly in hopes of using it to beat the overpowered Psychic Gym, only to find themselves losing even harder and not understanding why. We've reached out to World Champion Ash Ketchum for a statement regarding these allegations of misinformation and fake news. However, we have received no response as he has long since formally retired from being the show's main protagonist. All jokes aside, Psychic's Ghost immunity was likely one of the many programming errors of Generation 1. Apart from the anime, Nintendo's official player guidebook stated that Ghost was advantaged over Psychic, and an in-game NPC also stated Psychics only fear two things: bugs and ghosts. This error would later go on to be corrected in Generation 2, and Ghost has functioned as advertised ever since. However, even if you assume the type worked as intended, it's still offensively lackluster, being advantaged only against Psychic and itself, which were fairly rare types. The type's only offensive saving grace was that it wasn't resisted by, well, anything. Normal was immune to it, but that didn't really benefit Normal as much as the other way around. It's generally more beneficial to be immune to a common source of damage than to be immune to a rare one. You are far more likely to encounter multiple normal type Pokemon and normal type attacks throughout every game, making that immunity highly relevant. But you rarely encounter a ghost type Pokemon or ghost type attacks, making that immunity much more situational. In earlier generations, Ghost's neutral offense was quite poor because of various issues. In Gen 1, the only ghost type attack was Lick, which had a measly 20 power. Gen 2 created Shadow Ball, which was a powerful 80 power move with great distribution, something which types like Bug, Grass, and Fighting would have killed to have. Problem was, Ghost was a physical type. In a vacuum, that isn't inherently a problem. In fact, it's theoretically a benefit for the intended game design. Ghost was sold to players as being the Psychic counter of Gen 1. And a common feature of Psychic Pokemon was them having high special stats and low physical stats. So Ghost, being a physical damage type, would have let it strike Psychics harder on their weaker defense stat. In practice though, that theory never translated into reality, and to understand why, we need to look at Ghost Pokemon. Every type has a few of what I like to call archetypal Pokemon, which have a stat spread and playstyle which accurately reflect what their type's core identity is all about. For example, Geodude is the Rock type, being a slow physical tank. Caterpie represents the Bug type's trend of being weak, early evolving, early game Pokemon. Zubats and Weedle define the Poison type's tactics of being weak, but gradually grind down players through loads of chip damage. Dragonite sets the expectation of dragons being rare, with weak, hard to find pre-evolutions and massively powerful final evolutions locked behind high evolution level requirements. Ghost, however, doesn't do this. Now, my dear viewer, tell me, what is the iconic Ghost Pokemon? The first Pokemon or Pokemon line which immediately springs to mind the moment you think Ghost Pokemon. It's Gengar and the Ghastly line. Duh. The Ghastly line were the first ghost types of the series, the only ghost types in Gen 1, and effectively the only ghost types of Gen 2 as well, because Misdreavus was locked to the post-game. Gengar enjoys a reputation as a powerful Pokemon, has a long history of competitive success, and makes regular appearances across multiple games and external media to this very day. Even if you don't obtain it yourself, it is still often fought as a boss. If a game has the Ghastly line available, you can bet there's a major trainer somewhere using it. Agatha, Morty, Karen, Fantina, Black and White 2 Chantal, Title Defense Plumeria, Alistair, and so on. You need to try very hard to make a ghost team and not just slap in a Gengar, especially in the earlier generations. Gengar also has the honor of being one of 4 Pokemon who has both a Mega and G-Max form. And the other 3 are the Kanto starters, who get special treatment, so that isn't really fair to count. Gengar earned its popularity fair and square, but despite it being both the face of its type and one of the most popular Pokemon ever, it doesn't play like its type at all. My dear viewer, let me ask you this. If you had to design one and only one ghost Pokemon to represent the type, based on your knowledge of the type's strengths and weaknesses and the limitations of Gen 1, what sort of stats or playstyle would you give it? Go on, take a second to think it over. Most of you would probably make a mono ghost tank with high attack and defenses. After all, Ghost, as mentioned earlier, was a defensive specialist type with underwhelming offensive benefits and exceptional immunities, which dealt physical damage and was marketed as the game's main psychic counter. In other words, the best way to showcase the type's strengths would be to make something like Dusclops, which has the defensive stats to take full advantage of Ghost's defensive type benefits, or Banette, which has a high attack stat to be a psychic killer. Now, what was Gengar? Gengar was a speedy, frail, glass cannon special attacker with a non-existent attack stat, meaning it couldn't even use Shadow Ball, the ghost type's primary attack. It was also part poison, making it weak to psychic attacks, meaning it completely loses to most psychics. By the way, poison was also a physical damage type, meaning Gengar couldn't make offensive use of the type either. What happened? Why is the ghost type's key representative seemingly designed in such a counterintuitive fashion? To solve this contradiction, we now need to enter the realm of speculation and find the flow of logic which led to this outcome. Firstly, my dear viewer, we must discard the immediate automatic thought of lol because Gen 1 design is dumb. Don't lie to me, I'm sure some of you are thinking that. Partly because that thought shuts down all possibilities and kills off all intellectual discussion, but also partly because that isn't true. Gen 1 might have been ludicrously buggy and questionably balanced, but it's quite unfair to claim there was zero thought at all in the game's design with regard to Pokemon playstyles. The game did indeed have loads of bugs, and the design intent might not be perfect, but there was still planning and intent involved. In fact, if you look at most Pokemon, they tend to have stats which still make some degree of sense with their type. For example, every fighting type has a high attack stat, every psychic type has high special, every electric type has high speed, and so on. This was because many characters in games are typically built around archetypes to help structure and simplify the design process, especially early on, when you need to set up an entire battle system from scratch and also create a large starting roster of characters. You cannot afford to carefully design, balance, and playtest unique playstyles for every single one. What you do is you create a few general archetypes and make a bunch of characters that loosely fit those archetypes, basically copying your own homework and changing a few numbers here or there. For instance, Pidgeot, Fearow, and Dodrio all basically play almost identically to each other, just with slightly different move pools and more min-max stats. This is why game sequels tend to end up having significantly more features than their predecessor games. It's because all the groundwork has already been laid, so you can build on top of it. The sequel's playable roster can also become more complex because they have fewer playable characters to create, and can therefore opt for quality over quantity. Pokemon only tend to diverge from their type archetypes if their types are already fairly populated, and the Pokemon does need to feature more differences to distinguish themselves. For example, water is the second most abundant type in Gen 1, at 32 total Pokemon, only one behind Poison type's 33 Pokemon. Because of that, water type Pokemon featured a wide range of stat spreads. While most typically lean towards bulky defensive playstyles, you would also see speedy attackers like Starmie or physical attackers like Kingler and Gyarados. However, Ghost and Dragon would not encounter this issue because they are types with only one representative each, so there is no need to go against their type's intended archetype for the sake of differentiation at this point. They only did so in the future as more Ghost and Dragon type Pokemon got added, which subsequently needed to find ways to play differently. So, for whatever reason, we must assume that Gengar's stats were chosen to defy its type's archetype as a defensive specialist on purpose. It was an intentional design choice. So here's my hypothesis. The Ghost type was simply too damn good. The only Ghost type in the game needed to be intentionally made as terrible as possible to balance it. Ghost's focus on immunities created an issue which affects both players and in-game opponents. Like I said before, normal moves made up a huge portion of every Pokemon's natural learn set, because the design philosophy back then was for typed moves to be rare and exclusive. This means a player-controlled Ghost type completely walls out a huge number of in-game opponents, including numerous bosses. For reference, here is Lance's team in Red and Blue. Apart from Gyarados, Ghost completely walls him. The only thing that hurts you is Dragon Rage and its fixed 40 damage. Dragonite has only normal attacks. What's it gonna do against a Ghastly? Spam Barrier? Do we need a repeat of the Venomoth incident? Gengar also completely walls other major opponents like Giovanni and Bruno, and is mutually advantaged over Agatha. In fact, Gengar walls half of Blue's team. Vahidon, Executor, and Arcanine cannot touch it. Catching a Ghastly just means you get a free win against half of the game's final boss. I'm sure some of you viewers are thinking, just make the trainer switch then. Well, how often do trainers even switch today? Even in the modern day, in-game trainer switching is a rare sight because it significantly increases the difficulty of the fight. Remember how many of us got thrown for a loop because Cynthia decided to switch Mons that one time? Considering how severely flawed the first game's AI was, it's a bit much to expect them to have that figured out. They opted for a different solution by Yellow, giving everybody more diverse type coverage in their movesets, which also helped increase the overall difficulty. But, well, too late, Gengar already exists. As an opponent, Ghost's defensive qualities could also be a bit difficult for a player to handle. Remember that this was the first ever Pokemon game back in the 90s, and the primary target audience was kids. Players back then lacked the established knowledge of the type chart which we have today. Lavender Town and Pokemon Tower were a possible player progress trap, because some players might have just been brute forcing their way through the game with just normal moves. Remember that non-normal moves were fairly rare, especially at such an early point of the game. However, this potential trap was preemptively diffused because the player could just catch a wild Ghastly here. Now, what was the only way to hit Ghost super effectively again? With another Ghost. Sure is convenient that your first encounter with a Ghost type trainer is the same place where you can catch a Ghost Pokemon for yourself. Ghastly doesn't learn any normal moves, and comes equipped with Lick and Nightshade, letting it hurt enemy Ghastly super effectively. Ghastly itself also has a low base HP stat, meaning Nightshade's fixed damage can still yield meaningful results at this stage of the game. This ensures that, at an absolute last resort, a player with only normal attacks can always catch a Ghastly and brute force the tower with that. In both cases, it's possible that a defensive ghost type which could also deal actual damage or tank multiple hits would have been too challenging for both the player and the game AI to deal with. So Gengar got nerfed badly to keep the type in check. Its defenses were made weak so that it could be easily taken out if the opponent had a way to get around its immunities, keeping its walling abilities in check. Ghost still needed to be physical for the psychic interaction, but Gengar couldn't be allowed to deal high damage, so it got a weak attack stat and no good ghost moves, which left all of its remaining stats to be allocated into special and speed. You could also make a viable case for its secondary poison type being an intentional restriction. Mono Ghost would have been insane back then due to it lacking any weaknesses whatsoever, so a second type was added on to give it some weaknesses. And of all the available types, Poison was the best choice to weaken it. It provided zero benefit to Gengar whatsoever, because it is a physical damage type which Gengar lacks the attack stat to make use of, and Poison types typically opt for a defensive playstyle, which Gengar doesn't have the HP or defense stats for. From a visual standpoint, Poison is also the only type which would visually make sense to tack onto the Ghastly line. Just make up some lore stuff about the stereotypical ghost gas being poisonous and there you go, in-universe justification done. Speaking of poison gas, it doesn't learn that. In fact, the Ghastly line doesn't learn a single poison move at all, both by natural means or by TMs. The only exception was the Toxic TM, which doesn't quite count because literally every Pokemon can learn that. Even though the Sludge Bomb TM existed back in Gen 2, Gengar was not able to use it. It took until Gen 3 before it became Sludge Bomb compatible. And it doesn't get any poison moves through breeding and egg moves either. This abnormal absence of poison moves implies that Gengar was never originally intended to gain a single benefit out of its poison type. It existed solely to add disadvantages and nothing else. Everything about Gengar, from its stats to its move pool to its typing, was made to be as anti-synergistic as possible with Ghost as a type, and it was still amazing because the Ghost type's normal immunity was just that good. Keep in mind, despite all of this, Gengar still ended up becoming one of the undisputed best Pokemon in Gens 1 and 2. Imagine how incredible Gengar would have been if it was pure Ghost, had actual defenses, was a physical attacker, and had a proper stab move to use. Man, if Dusknoir existed back then, it would probably be one of the best Pokemon in the game. Sorry my dude, you were 3 generations too late. At least you'll always have Ice Punch. So that's the ghost of the past. But what about the ghosts of present and future? How did the type evolve over time? While normal remained the same, Ghost, appropriately enough, changed drastically. In fact, it probably changed the most out of all the types, mostly because it gained actual moves and Pokemon. In Gen 2, Ghost was part of the first great type rebalancing, and was made weak to Dark and resisted by Steel, similar to Psychic. This, once again, implies that the designers viewed it as too powerful at the time. Gen 2 also introduced an actual attack move for the type in Shadow Ball, and introduced Mischievous, which opted for a more tricky playstyle, with the Perish Song Mean Look trap combo. Gen 3 is when Ghost took its biggest step forwards, and truly began to build on the initial foundation concepts established in Gen 1. By this point, the overall design philosophy regarding move pools had changed. The previous RPG-style formula of treating normal moves like basic attacks and typed moves like fancy magic attacks shifted to the formula we have today, with stabs being used as primary attacks, which are complemented with coverage moves of different types. Move pools started including a wider variety of various type moves, making normal moves less omnipresent than before, and Ghost's normal immunity became less dominating as a result. Prior to Gen 3, it was very reasonable for a player or AI opponent to have a couple Pokemon that only know normal moves and nothing else. By Gen 3, the move pool improvements had made that situation incredibly unlikely. Between the Gen 3 design philosophy shift and the Gen 2 type additions, the developers had likely felt Ghost was now balanced to be on equal standing with all the other types, and thus took off prior design limitations. Ghost Pokemon were now made much more accessible than before, with Gen 3 adding 4 new Ghost Pokemon lines, each of which possessed qualities which accurately reflected the strengths of the Ghost type in different ways. Dusclops was the defensive tank that Ghost was always meant to be. Banette was the physical attacker which Ghost never had. Sableye upgraded upon Ghost's original Gen 1 defensive playstyle of having only immunities but 0 weaknesses, by having a type combination with 3 immunities and 0 weaknesses, but only 1 resistance. And then there's Shedinja, which goes all in on Ghost's original gimmick of being frail, yet also untouchable, dying easily if you do manage to bypass its untouchability. Ghost also gained a significant type-defining new move in Will-O-Wisp. This gave Ghost convenient access to the burn status, further improving upon the type's defensive qualities. I know that Will-O-Wisp is listed as a fire move, but its early distribution primarily gave it to Ghost, making it more of a Ghost move in practice. The typing seems more of a technicality. They also loosened the restrictions on Gengar by giving it Levitate, which provided a third immunity to one of Poison's weaknesses, which, once again, adds to the hypothesis that Gengar was given Poison solely to nerf it. Now that Ghost is balanced, Gengar doesn't need the added nerf anymore, but they can't remove the typing, so they'll just give it an ability instead. Gen 4 more or less developed Ghost in the same ways as all the other types, giving it a bunch of new moves as part of the physical special split. This had the side effect of unleashing Gengar's full potential, as it was now able to run Shadow Ball and Sludge Bomb off its huge special attack stat. Notably, this is the last major batch of general Ghost moves we would receive for some time. The majority of Ghost moves added in future generations would end up being signature moves of various Pokemon. Aside from generic attack moves, Ghost moves were designed around a strange theming of the user's death, PP depletion, and most uniquely, status effect combos. Destiny Bond and Grudge required the user to be KO'd by the opponent on that turn to activate their effects. Curse half kills the user but applies a status which deals 25% of the target's HP per turn. Grudge and Spite are the only moves in the game capable of reducing the opponent's PP. The only exceptions are the signature moves of Galarian Slowking and G-Max Duraludon. Perhaps the design intent there was to deplete the PP of all possible coverage moves which could hurt the Ghost, thus leaving the opponent with nothing but normal attacks? Didn't really work out in practice though. Lastly, Nightmare is a unique instance of a combo attack which is dependent on a status, only working if the opponent is put to sleep, probably via hypnosis. This unique property is shared with the Psychic type Dream Eater. Gen 5 would later give us Hex, which also follows up on the combo idea by doubling in damage if the target has a status. That's not exactly much to comment on though. After Gen 3, nothing particularly significant changed for the Ghost type for several generations. It more or less got treated the same as every other type, and saw the addition of many new Pokemon and abilities which subverted existing type interactions in interesting ways. Such as Gen 5 introducing Scrappy, which allows the user's attacks to ignore Ghost's immunities. That is, until Gen 6 brought about the second great type rebalancing. The addition of the fancy new fairy type occupied the spotlight, but Ghost received a small yet invaluable buff. It was no longer resisted by Steel, and now deals neutral damage to it. This was perhaps done to limit Steel's dominance. It was already the best overall type in the game, so giving it another full advantage over Fairy for free might have been a bit too much. So it lost 2 resistances in equivalent exchange for gaining an offensive and defensive advantage over the newly added Fairy type. But forget that for now. This isn't the Steel or Fairy video, this is the Ghost video. This change shifted Ghost from a defensive focused type to a more balanced offensive one. Now there are fewer tanks capable of consistently resisting powerful Ghost attacks. Ghost's neutral offensive damage, previously seen as a drawback during the early Gen 1 days where super effective damage was heavily valued, turned into an asset in this modern era focused around using powerful neutral damage stabs. The only thing which limited Ghost type's offense was the now comparatively unimpressive Shadow Ball. 80 base power was incredible back in Gen 2 because many types such as Flying, Fighting, Grass, and Dragon still lacked widely accessible high damage moves. These gaps were gradually filled by new, powerful additions such as Brave Bird, Close Combat, Leaf Storm, and Draco Meteor, which far surpassed Shadow Ball in power. And many modern moves with 75 to 80 power tend to have way better secondary effects than Shadow Ball's chance-based stat drop, such as Scald and Lava Plume's chance to burn, Discharge's chance to paralyze, Dark Pulse and Waterfall's chance to flinch, Psyshock hitting physical defense, U-turn giving a free switch, Dazzling Gleam hitting both targets in doubles, and so on. Even types like Fairy and Psychic received 90 power options, while Ghost was still stuck with 80 power Shadow Ball even after all these years. Shadow Ball was excellent because it got introduced at a point when many other types were far behind. Now those types have caught up, making Shadow Ball's damage merely just average in comparison. Special attacking Ghost Pokemon needed to rely on their base stats, abilities, and alternative stabs to output heavy damage, and they needed truly insane stats to accomplish that. Aegislash had 150 special attack before it got nerfed. Chandelure had 145, Blacephalon had 151, Fluttermane had 135 and a free stat boost from its ability. 80 power Shadow Ball from these Pokemon hit hard because they were already statistical monsters who could benefit from Ghost's great neutral offense. But other Ghosts with more normal special attack stats just got left behind. They didn't have any generally accessible high power moves to bring their offensive potential to the next level, and that's for special offense. Physical attacking Ghosts were stuck with the weaker Shadow Claw for a main attack, or the even worse Shadow Punch in poor Dusknoir's case. The poor guy really got shafted in all the worst ways possible, didn't he? At least he'll always have that incredible story appearance in Mystery Dungeon. Apart from signature moves, Ghost remained with its mediocre Shadow Ball and Shadow Claw for another 2 generations. Gen 7 didn't see any notable changes, though amusingly, Gengar was judged to be too powerful and got its levitate rights revoked, forcing it to walk on the ground like the rest of us plebs. That all changed in Gen 8. The Isle of Armor DLC introduced Poltergeist, providing physical ghosts with a 110 power stab option, which greatly boosted the viability of Ghost offense even further. Finally, after all these years, Dusknoir finally gets to use its attack stat for something. But that's only for physical ghosts. Special attacking ghosts were still stuck with Shadow Ball, which is probably for the best. Can you imagine if Fluttermane had a Fire Blast equivalent for a ghost attack? Yeesh. And so we arrive at the present day. Gen 9 didn't bring any changes to the type in general, but added a whole list of stupidly powerful offensive ghost Pokemon. Skeledirge, Cerulege, Annihilape, Gholdengo, Sinistra, Houndstone, and the aforementioned Fluttermane. The Ghost type has really changed a lot over the years, arguably the most out of all types in the series. It initially started out as a defensive focus type, which was so good that its sole representative got heavily nerfed to limit it. Then the type was overall nerfed by the addition of Steel and Dark, which brought it down to the level of most of the other types. Since the type was now balanced, the game designers became less hesitant about using it and created many Ghost Pokemon and moves which properly defined the type's playstyle. As more Ghost Pokemon got created, they began to explore different playstyles and ways of using the type. In general, both the Ghost type and Ghost Pokemon were pretty solid at this point. Then Gen 6 removed Steel's resistance to Ghost, and Ghost became really good. Now it's a potential offensive powerhouse of a type, still retaining many of the defensive qualities which originally made it great, but also boasting excellent neutral offensive capability as well. Ghost Pokemon themselves also reflected this shift. Many Ghosts from previous generations tended to lean towards bulky defensive playstyles, but most of the best Ghosts of today are extremely offensive and take advantage of both the type's neutral offenses to output consistently high damage and defensive immunities to secure free switch-ins and stay relatively safe. The many slow yet steady improvements over the years have resulted in Ghost going from amazing in one way to amazing in the opposite way. I don't think any other type has seen so many changes across all of Pokemon history, yet still found different ways to remain consistently great and relevant. It is truly no exaggeration to call Ghost one of the most powerful types in all of Pokemon. It was powerful back in the past, it is powerful now in the present, and I wholly expect it to continue being powerful in the future for many years to come.